It was the kind of evening that didn't stand out, the kind of ordinary that families never think twice about. Warm air, cicadas humming in the grass, and a playground filled with the echo of children's laughter. A neighborhood park tucked into the middle of a modest cul-de-sac in eastern Missouri. The kind of place where parents sat on benches scrolling through their phones or chatting in small knots while their kids ran wild, barefoot, and carefree. It was a Thursday, mid-June. School had just let out for the summer, and for most people in the neighborhood, it was just another lazy dusk. Until it wasn't. Around 7:15 p.m., multiple witnesses remembered seeing 7-year-old Evan Mitchell climb the ladder to the metal slide, one of the taller ones, the kind that curved once before hitting the sand below. His mother, Jamie, had been standing near the swings, deep in conversation with another mom about weekend plans. She remembered glancing toward the slide once, just once, and seeing Evan wave at her from the top. That would be the last time she'd ever see him. From there, time fractured, kids scattered. Some claimed Evan slid down and ran toward the monkey bars. Others thought he ran behind the slide into the trees. One boy said Evan was pretending to dig in the sand and then just wasn't there anymore. The chaos began quietly, a slow ripple of uncertainty as parents started calling out names, scanning the playground for familiar heads. At first, no one panicked. Maybe he ran to the water fountain. Maybe he was hiding. Kids do that. But after 10 minutes of searching, that slow ripple turned to dread. Jamie began yelling. Not calling, yelling. The kind of voice you use when your body already knows something is wrong, but your brain is fighting to catch up. Other parents joined her, spreading out across the small park, ducking behind trees, checking the parking lot, even peering into trash cans with a rising sense of horror they couldn't explain. By 7:38, someone called 911. The dispatcher noted a missing juvenile, male, 7 years old, last seen wearing blue gym shorts and a red t-shirt with dinosaurs on it. Within 12 minutes, 2 cruisers arrived, and by 8 p.m., the entire park was sealed off with yellow tape. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon. Officers canvassed the area. They asked parents to remain calm. They asked the kids questions. What did you see? Who was he with? Did anyone strange talk to him? The answers were a frustrating swirl of contradictions. Some thought they saw a man in a hoodie near the bike rack. Others insisted Evan was alone the whole time. One girl said she thought she saw him crawl under the slide, but when police looked, there was nothing there. Just cool sand, slightly compacted from foot traffic, but undisturbed. No one could pinpoint the moment he disappeared. It was like watching a magic trick in reverse. Everyone looking in the right place, but the boy was gone. Helicopters were called in before nightfall. Officers with K-9 units scoured the nearby woods. They found a couple of footprints by the edge of the brush, but they were quickly lost in the undergrowth and later determined to be inconclusive. A small creek ran nearby, so divers were brought in to sweep the shallow water. Nothing. No clothing, no shoes, no torn backpack, not a single clue. By 10 p.m., the search radius expanded to 2 miles. House by house, officers knocked on doors. Some people welcomed them in, others seemed annoyed, but no one had seen anything. Back at the park, Jamie collapsed on the wood chips near the base of the slide. Her husband, Eric, arrived from work in time to find his wife sobbing into the shoulder of a patrol officer. He hadn't even known Evan was missing. He thought his son was home finishing his dinosaur puzzle. That's the detail he couldn't stop repeating later. He thought Evan was home finishing his puzzle. By midnight, the park was lit up like a crime scene. Flashlights cut through the trees. Officers combed storm drains. A local search and rescue team showed up with infrared drones, sweeping over every inch of the playground and its surrounding woods. Again, nothing. No heat signatures, no movement. It was as if the ground had swallowed the boy whole. That was how one officer described it in a private report later leaked to the media. There was no exit. He just disappeared. 1 second, he was on the slide. The next, he was nowhere. Parents were finally sent home around 2 a.m., though few slept. Patrol cars remained in the area through the night. Volunteers were told to gather at a local church the next morning. Flyers were already being printed. Local news stations picked up the story just before dawn. A smiling photo of Evan, gap-toothed, grinning, clutching a toy T-Rex, flashed across the screen under bold letters, 7-year-old boy missing from local park. But underneath the headlines, there was something else, something unspoken, a quiet, growing fear that Evan hadn't run off or gotten lost. Something about the way he vanished didn't make sense, and by morning, that fear would begin to evolve into something else, suspicion. Because if Evan never left the park, then the question wasn't just where he had gone. It was who might have watched him go. As the last streaks of daylight vanished behind the trees, the search for Evan Mitchell accelerated into something far more desperate. Officers from 2 nearby jurisdictions arrived on site to support the local department, setting up a mobile command unit near the park's southern entrance. Within the hour, a highway patrol helicopter equipped with thermal imaging swept over the surrounding fields and tree lines. Every rotation of its searchlight cast long, shifting shadows across the sand and plastic of the now-abandoned playground. The slide where Evan was last seen had already been cordoned off with yellow tape. It stood cold and still, untouched since sunset. Volunteers began arriving in waves, neighbors, church friends, even strangers from the next town over who'd seen the boy's photo online. A search grid was drawn over a 5-mile radius. By 10:30 p.m., human chains began moving through the woods behind the park. Dozens of people walking shoulder to shoulder, eyes locked to the ground, calling Evan's name in low, solemn voices. Some carried flashlights, others simply walked in silence, scanning tree roots, bushes, and creek banks, hoping to spot something. A shoe, a toy, anything. In the pond about 600 feet from the playground, divers from the county's rescue unit entered the cold water in full gear. The surface was still, only occasionally disturbed by frogs or the ripple of a snapping turtle, but the divers worked methodically, inch by inch. Sonar equipment was deployed, and a small team searched with weighted lines. Despite the darkness, the water was shallow, and every corner of it was accounted for. No signs of Evan, no clothes floating near the shore, no drag marks, no blood, just mud, reeds, and silence. The K-9 units brought in from Jefferson County traced Evan's scent to the base of the slide and a few feet beyond. But then, according to handlers, it just stopped. Not weakened. Stopped. Like the trail had been vacuumed out of existence. One handler later said it was one of the most unusual cases he'd ever worked. Usually, even in abductions, there's a trail, a direction. But here, there was nothing. It was as if the child had never taken a single step after leaving the top of the slide. At 2:15 a.m., a deputy found what appeared to be a small footprint near the edge of a drainage ditch behind the swing set. They taped it off and photographed it under multiple lighting angles, but forensics would later conclude it was too smudged and partial to match to Evan. And besides, there was no second print, no walking path, just one soft indentation in the earth, and then nothing. Helicopters continued overhead until just before 3 a.m., running low on fuel. The thermal imaging hadn't picked up anything that matched human heat signatures, though several deer and a stray dog had initially raised false hope. The wind picked up as the temperature dropped. Most of the volunteers were sent home, their faces blank with frustration. Many would return the next morning. Some wouldn't. By dawn, the only ones still on scene were the officers, the family, and a few of the more obsessive neighbors. Evan's mother had refused to leave. She sat inside a squad car with a blanket around her shoulders, staring at the swing set like it might start talking. His father paced behind the slide, retracing invisible steps, mumbling to himself over and over, asking how a child could disappear in an open space surrounded by 50 people and no one see a thing. Investigators began considering new angles. Stranger abduction. A known offender in the area. They pulled sex offender registry maps and highlighted every residence within a 2-mile radius. Officers were dispatched to knock on doors and conduct quick checks. 2 men weren't home. One worked nights, the other had left town for a funeral. Alibis would later check out. Search teams moved beyond the park. Creeks were dragged, drainage pipes checked. Utility workers were brought in to help open sealed manholes. Nothing, not even a scrap of clothing. The playground sand itself was sifted, shovelful by shovelful. By mid-morning, they'd excavated 3 feet down across the entire base of the slide. Nothing but sand and a few discarded toy cars. Detectives turned to the possibility that Evan had wandered off, that maybe, scared or confused, he had run into the woods, but cadaver dogs didn't alert, and if he were alive and hiding, he would have responded to the shouting. No 7-year-old could stay hidden that long in the wild, barefoot in the dark, surrounded by searchers. Still, the theory was added to the list. At 11 a.m., the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team was contacted, standard in cases where a child disappears under highly suspicious circumstances. They agreed to send a field agent to assess whether federal resources should be deployed. By that point, local authorities had to admit something chilling. There was no physical evidence to suggest Evan had ever left the park. Word spread fast. News vans parked at the edge of the neighborhood. Reporters began knocking on doors. Locals grew tight-lipped. Everyone had a theory, none of them good. Some whispered about human trafficking. Others blamed someone inside the community. A few neighbors grew suspicious of each other. Friendships frayed. Backyard fences that were once open now stood locked. And amid it all, the fact remained unchanged. Evan had disappeared from a place where no child should have been able to vanish. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign of a struggle. Just a boy, a slide, and a silence that no one could explain. By the 3rd day, the search had turned into something colder, more clinical. The urgency remained, but the hope, the real, electric kind, had started to fade. The flyers were still going up, the volunteer base still strong, but behind the scenes, the focus had shifted. No longer a wide-eyed search for a lost boy in the woods. Now, investigators began treating the disappearance of Evan Mitchell as a likely abduction. And statistically, in cases like these, they knew where they had to look first, within the boy's immediate circle. Detectives began re-interviewing every adult who had been at the park that night, not just the ones who spoke up early, but the ones who had stayed quiet. Jamie and Eric Mitchell were brought in separately. They were cooperative, but raw. Jamie trembled through most of her interview, hands clutched in her lap, barely able to answer questions about Evan's behavior that week, their home routine, or any recent visitors. Eric's answers were shorter, more controlled. He admitted he hadn't spent much time at the park in general. He worked late shifts and mostly saw Evan during dinner and bedtime. When asked if there were any marital issues or custody concerns, he shook his head, flatly. No hesitation. But something in his tone unsettled the detective taking notes, the kind of hardness that grief sometimes hides behind. Over the next 48 hours, the Mitchells' home was searched with their consent. Closets, backyard sheds, crawl spaces, browser histories, nothing flagged. Forensics found no trace of struggle, no disturbing writings, no erased messages. But a few minor details stood out. Evan's bed wasn't slept in the night before. The sheets were slightly crumpled but flat. Jamie said he had trouble sleeping and often ended up on the couch or in their bed. It was a small thing, but investigators marked it down. They had to. At that point, everything was a clue or a dead end. They wouldn't know which until much later. Attention turned to the other adults at the park. A dozen names. 9 of them were neighborhood regulars, parents with no record, no red flags. But one name stood out. Alan Tripp, a 28-year-old man who lived 2 streets away. He had no children. According to a witness, he'd been sitting on a bench near the slide for about 30 minutes the night Evan vanished. At first, police thought he might have been meeting someone, maybe just resting after a jog. But when they visited his home, he denied being at the park at all, said he was watching a movie alone, no receipts, no alibi. His apartment was clean, almost too clean. But when officers searched his trash, they found a crumpled-up flyer with Evan's face on it, torn in half. That was enough to bring him in for formal questioning. For 6 hours, Tripp was interviewed. He never asked for a lawyer, never raised his voice. He said he tore the flyer out of frustration, that he'd seen the search and wanted to help but felt powerless. His story wavered under pressure but never cracked. No physical evidence linked him to Evan, no fibers, no fingerprints, no video. Eventually, he was released. But word spread. Fast. Within a day, neighbors began to talk, on front lawns, on Facebook threads, in hushed text chains. Rumors twisted the truth. Some claimed Tripp had been caught with Evan's shoe. Others said he had a history with children. Neither was true. But none of it mattered. His porch was egged that night. The next morning, he was gone. Pressure mounted in every direction. The police chief gave a press conference promising that all leads were being followed, but his body language told a different story. He looked like a man drowning. Jamie stopped speaking to reporters altogether. Eric at one point snapped at a cameraman for getting too close to their porch. The town, once tightly knit, began to turn inward. People who had lived side by side for years now watched, each other with suspicion. Detectives clung to timelines, but they kept falling apart. Some parents couldn't remember if Evan was on the slide at 7:10 or 7:20. One child insisted he saw a red truck near the swings, but no such vehicle appeared on any footage. Another witness said a man had walked into the bathroom carrying something under his jacket, but they couldn't recall the man's face, and no security footage covered that area. It became a story of missing minutes, incomplete glances, broken memory. The worst part was the silence. With each passing day, the phone rang less, tips dried up, posters curled under the summer heat. The pond, searched 3 times, became a place people avoided. A few volunteers kept returning to the woods, convinced they'd missed something, but they never found a thing. And through all of it, the question kept resurfacing. Not just who could have taken Evan, but how. How could a child disappear from a park full of adults? Why didn't anyone see him leave? Why was there no sound, no scream, no struggle? The more time passed, the more that single inexplicable fact began to weigh on everyone involved. Not just the possibility of a stranger or a misstep, but the possibility that someone Evan trusted had done this and gotten away with it. That was the detail that kept detectives awake at night, the one possibility that, if true, meant they'd been looking in all the wrong places. By autumn, the park was quiet again. The yellow tape had long since been removed. Kids had started coming back slowly, but they stayed close to their parents. The slide, once the centerpiece, stood mostly untouched. It had become a marker of something unspoken, a reminder of how quickly normal could unravel. The flyers with Evan's photo were still up, though the edges had curled from rain, sun, and wind. Some had faded until his face was barely visible. Others were removed, replaced with new ones that looked identical, except the urgency was gone. It had become ritual now, not hope, just habit. At the precinct, the case file sat thick and silent, filling a shelf in the major crimes office. Over 1,200 pages, dozens of interviews, forensic logs, maps, surveillance printouts, drone photos, all of it meticulously cataloged, yet useless. For every lead followed, 2 more emerged. Most were dead ends. Some were cruel. In mid-September, a man in a neighboring county claimed to have seen Evan boarding a Greyhound bus. He insisted the child looked confused, dirty, and alone. Officers reviewed footage from every nearby terminal. No match. A week later, someone else reported seeing Evan at a Walmart in Illinois. The grainy security footage showed a boy in a red shirt, but it wasn't him. Just another family, another normal day. Another 30 hours of manpower lost. In October, an anonymous tip came in through the department's tip line. A voice said they'd seen a red truck parked behind the community center the night of Evan's disappearance. When pressed for details, the caller hung up. Officers pulled months of traffic cam data, looking for any red pickup that might have entered or exited the neighborhood between 6:30 and 8 p.m. They found 3. One belonged to a contractor working on a roofing job nearby. One was a local high school teacher. The third was registered to a woman in her 60s who hadn't driven in weeks. None had any connection to Evan or the park. By late fall, psychic hotlines began contacting the family. Some said Evan was buried near water. Others claimed he was alive and being held in a rural basement. One woman mailed Jamie a drawing of a tunnel and said it had come to her in a dream. Police were obligated to log everything, but none of it held weight. Detectives stopped calling them leads. They started calling them noise. Inside the Mitchell home, the silence had grown unbearable. Eric went back to work part-time in October. Jamie didn't. She stayed home, reorganizing closets, rereading reports, building her own timeline with sticky notes and red string. Some days, she didn't speak at all. Others, she left voicemails for detectives in the middle of the night with new theories she'd pieced together. None of them ever led anywhere. But they never ignored her. They couldn't. She was the only one still acting like the case wasn't dead. In December, Evan would have turned 8. The family held a small vigil at the park. A few neighbors came, some didn't. The local news station sent a camera crew, but Jamie refused to give an interview. Instead, she stood by the slide holding a candle, eyes unfocused, not speaking. She stayed long after everyone left. She left a new toy at the foot of the ladder. It was a small plastic dinosaur still in its box. Winter blanketed the investigation in something deeper than snow. Stillness. The town stopped talking. The officers stopped digging. The leads stopped coming. The FBI pulled back. The active search window closed. By March, the case was formally reclassified as cold. The same detective who'd been there on night 1, who'd coordinated search lines and stood ankle-deep in the creek calling Evan's name, signed the transfer form to cold case status. He said it felt like letting go of a rope that had already been cut months earlier. But cold cases don't mean forgotten. It meant fewer hours, not 0. It meant the command center was shut down, but the file could still be pulled. It meant Evan's name stayed in the database, flagged to alert if anything surfaced that bore his DNA, his dental records, his likeness, every fingerprint scanned at a border, every unidentified child in the country. His profile remained open, but the people involved were moved to other cases, resources reallocated. The story from the outside began to dim. There were no more nightly updates, no more fresh flyers, no more prayer circles at the school gym. Time moved on because it had to, but underneath the surface, the wound never fully healed. Not for the family, not for the officers who failed to bring him home, and not for the neighborhood, where children still played under watchful eyes, where parents still glanced over their shoulders at slides and sandboxes that once felt safe. Every once in a while, a new rumor would flare up, a child spotted near a highway, a backpack left in a truck stop, a confession whispered by a drifter. But every single time, the end result was the same. It wasn't Evan, and each disappointment chipped away at what little was left of certainty. And then the waiting began. The kind that stretches not for hours or days, but years. The kind of waiting that doesn't fade with time, only deepens. Because what haunted everyone wasn't just the absence, it was the question. If Evan had never left the park, where had he gone? 9 years later, the slide is still there, faded now, the once bright plastic dulled by time, weather, and silence. Children play nearby again. Different children, from newer families who moved in after everything happened. Some of them know the story. Most don't. The ones who do don't speak about it aloud. It's just something they've absorbed through whispers, overheard corrections, or the occasional sudden hush that falls over a conversation when someone mentions the old Mitchell boy. The town doesn't talk about it anymore, not because they've forgotten, but because remembering feels too heavy and too useless. But every June 17th, without fail, 2 people return. Jamie and Eric Mitchell. They arrive just after sunrise, before the other families begin to fill the park. No ceremony, no crowd, just the 2 of them. Jamie carries a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in soft paper. Eric brings a folding chair. They don't speak much during the visit. Sometimes they sit in silence for an hour, sometimes less. Always they place the flowers at the base of the slide, right where Evan was last seen. Then they leave. They never stay long enough for the press to find them, though for years they used to try. The Mitchells never moved. They still live in the same house with the same red shutters Evan helped paint when he was 6. The mailbox still has his name stenciled on the side, just under his parents'. Inside, almost nothing has changed. His bedroom remains intact. Dinosaur decals still cling to the walls. His small shoes line the closet floor. The bed has fresh sheets, changed every Sunday. Jamie vacuums the room weekly, though no one enters it, not even Eric. She says it helps. No one argues. On the fridge, a calendar marks each passing year with colored pins. Red for birthdays, blue for search anniversaries, yellow for vigils. They stopped holding public ones around year 5. The turnout had dropped off sharply, and the last time they tried, a stranger showed up just to ask if they'd ever considered moving on. Eric walked him off the property, without a word. Jamie didn't speak for 2 days after that. Their marriage held, but just barely. Grief rewired everything. Eric returned to his old construction job, pouring himself into routines. Jamie never went back to work. Instead, she took up documenting. Boxes of newspaper clippings, case reports, message board screenshots, anything that mentioned Evan, even in passing. At night, she still checks the missing kids database, scrolling through unfamiliar faces and wondering what he'd look like at 16, at 17. A few times she thought she saw him, once in a grocery store in Kansas, once on a late-night news clip in Oregon. Each time it wasn't him. Each time it took her longer to recover. A local journalist, working on a cold case series, reached out in the spring of the 9th year. Her name was Riley Monroe. Young, tenacious, and new to the area. She didn't know the case well, but was immediately pulled in. What struck her wasn't just the tragedy of the disappearance, but the way the town had folded itself around the absence like a bruise. No memorials, no plaque, no formal closure, just a deep silence that had become part of the landscape. She reached out to Jamie, expecting a polite refusal. Instead, Jamie invited her over. They spoke for 6 hours. Jamie showed her Evan's room, his drawings, the voicemail he left 2 days before he vanished, a quick, cheerful message reminding her to bring juice boxes for park day. Riley said later that the house didn't feel like a home frozen in grief. It felt like a home waiting for someone who was just late. That struck her harder than anything. The idea that time hadn't healed anything, hadn't even tried. It had simply slowed down in that house, bent under the weight of one unanswered question. When Riley's article published, it sparked brief attention online. People shared it. A podcast mentioned it. A few new theories emerged, some helpful, most not. One claimed Evan had been taken by a trafficking ring operating along Highway 61. Another claimed the slide had a hidden compartment which police had somehow missed. Jamie read every word. Eric didn't read it at all. By then, he'd accepted that every burst of attention ended the same way, with nothing. The town didn't respond to the article publicly, but people noticed. A few flowers appeared at the park that week. Someone placed a small stuffed dinosaur near the base of the slide. An anonymous letter showed up at the Mitchells' doorstep that simply said, "He's not forgotten." Jamie cried for the first time in months, not out of hope, but from the reminder that someone besides her still remembered he existed. Behind all of it, one truth remained. There was still no body, no witness, no answers. Just 2 parents, 9 years older, with backs a little more hunched, voices a little more measured, and grief that had stopped screaming and started whispering. A grief that had calcified into ritual, returning each year to the place where their son had vanished into air, placing lilies on the sand, and staring at the slide that once echoed with laughter. Because even now, after 9 years of silence, they don't visit that park for closure. They go because it's the only place left where he might still return. It was a Wednesday morning in early April when the call came in. The night before, a windstorm had swept through the area, knocking over trees, scattering trash cans, and sending dust whipping through the streets. Nothing catastrophic, just loud, fast, and unexpected. The the kind of storm that rattles windows and leaves a layer of grime on everything it passes. At 6:47 a.m., two maintenance workers from Parks and Rec pulled up to Meadowbrook Park to assess minor damage. Their job was routine: clean the walking path, rehang a loose swing, and redistribute the sand under the old slide, which had been partially blown downhill by the wind. What they didn't expect was to see a patch of pale white near the base, something irregular protruding through the granules. At first, they thought it was trash, maybe an old plastic pipe, maybe a buried toy. But as one of the workers kicked at the mound, he froze. What surfaced wasn't plastic, it was bone. Within minutes, the park was closed. Again, a small yellow perimeter went up, followed by a larger one. The first responding officer had been on the force for 13 years. He had worked the Mitchell case during the initial search. He recognized the slide immediately, and when he looked down into the disturbed patch of sand, he said later, he felt something collapse in his chest. It wasn't just the discovery, it was the implication. They had searched this park over and over. They had dug, they had scanned, and yet here it was, evidence, right where it had all begun. By 9 a.m., crime scene investigators were on site. Shovels were brought in, but used sparingly. A delicate excavation began. Forensics set up a small tent around the site. Every scoop was photographed, every layer documented. And slowly, over the course of the day, the pale shape beneath the sand began to take form. What emerged wasn't a full skeleton, at least not at first. It was a portion of a small rib cage curled inward. Tattered red fabric clung to part of it, faded and sun-bleached but still recognizable. It was the same fabric from the shirt Evan Mitchell had been wearing the day he vanished. News didn't break immediately. Authorities wanted confirmation before making any public statement. The remains were carefully lifted from the sand and transported to the state medical examiner's office. DNA was expedited. It would take 2 days to confirm what everyone already knew. But for investigators, the more pressing question wasn't who. It was how. How had they missed this? How could the remains of a missing child lie undetected for nearly a decade in a location that had been one of the most thoroughly searched areas in town? Internal memos show that officers reviewed search records from the first 72 hours after Evan disappeared. Search logs indicated that the sand under the slide had been sifted by volunteers. Dogs had passed through. A cadaver dog had even walked directly over that area. There had been nothing at the time, or so they believed. Experts were brought in to explain how remains could have been buried and yet remain hidden. Some pointed to wind patterns and natural sand shifts over time. Others believed the bones had not been there the entire time. The latter theory was the one that disturbed investigators the most, because if Evan's body hadn't been buried there in June of 2016, then someone had returned later, quietly, carefully, and placed him there. The Mitchells were notified in person. Jamie collapsed. Eric didn't speak. A family liaison was assigned to walk them through what was known, which wasn't much. The clothing matched. The DNA was a match, and the area had shown no signs of disturbance before the storm. The implication was horrifying. Either everyone had missed the obvious for 9 years, or someone had managed to hide him beneath their feet and walk away unseen. Both possibilities were unbearable. 2 days later, the town learned what the family already knew. A press conference was held. The police chief stood behind a row of microphones and read from a short, prepared statement. Human remains discovered beneath the slide had been positively identified as those of Evan Mitchell. No further details were released. The press asked questions. Most went unanswered. When asked how a child could be buried in a public park without being found, the chief only said, "We are reviewing every part of this investigation. Every detail. We owe it to the Mitchell family. And we owe it to Evan." The community's reaction was immediate and conflicted. Some were devastated. Others were angry. A few demanded accountability. Parents who had once let their children return to the playground stopped again. Flowers reappeared. So did reporters. But no one had answers, no new suspects, no surveillance, no confessions, just the remains of a boy found under sand that had already been searched. And as the story resurfaced, so did the pain. Not just for the Mitchells, but for the officers who had poured weeks of their lives into that park, for the neighbors who had stood in search lines, for the children who had grown up in the shadow of Evan's absence. Because now, a new truth had taken root, one that changed everything they thought they knew about that night. Evan Mitchell had never left the playground. He had been there the entire time. The official excavation began just after sunrise. The site was already cordoned off, but now the scene shifted from discovery to evidence. Crime scene technicians in hazmat suits stepped carefully into the sandbox beneath the old metal slide, moving slow, deliberate, and silent. There were no assumptions, no shortcuts. The entire area was treated as a fresh crime scene, even though the crime, whatever it was, had occurred nearly a decade earlier. Forensic teams brought in industrial sifters, vacuum devices, specialized lighting, and ground-penetrating radar. But despite the equipment, much of the work came down to hands and small brushes. Grain by grain, they began peeling back the earth. Within the first few hours, more bones emerged, small, fragile. Most were intact, although the natural process of decomposition had left parts fragmented and scattered. There were no obvious signs of trauma, no immediate indicators of blunt force or sharp object injuries. But nothing could be ruled out. Time had eroded most of what might have once spoken loudly. A small, frayed sneaker sole was found near what appeared to be the pelvic area. Its fabric was nearly gone, but the outline and material matched the shoes Evan had been wearing the day he vanished. Near it, investigators uncovered what was left of a child's red shirt, torn in places, faded, and embedded with sand, but still unmistakable. A faint green dinosaur print on the front was partially preserved. It matched the shirt Evan's mother had described in her first interview, word for word. Every fragment was photographed and cataloged. Temperature, humidity, soil depth, moisture, all recorded. It wasn't just about confirming identity, it was about context. Forensic anthropologists needed to understand whether the body had been there for 9 years or buried more recently. Subtle shifts in decomposition could offer clues, but that analysis would take time. What they could do quickly, though, was run a DNA match. Within 48 hours, the results came back. Mitochondrial DNA taken from a tooth fragment confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The remains were Evan Mitchell's. The boy who had disappeared in a park full of people had never left. He had been buried just beneath the surface the entire time. The implications were staggering. In 2016, this exact area had been searched. Dogs had passed over it. Volunteers had sifted the top layer of sand. So how had he been missed? Experts proposed possibilities: shifting terrain, sand buildup, inadequate tools. But none of it settled the unease. Because even with imperfect conditions, it was difficult to accept that no one had noticed a thing. Not a smell, not a single disturbance. It wasn't just a matter of being buried. It was the absence of any trace. No drag marks, no compressed soil, no erosion patterns indicating older burial. Some investigators leaned toward a chilling theory. The burial had occurred after the initial search window. That someone had come back. That someone had waited. Whether it happened days later or years later remained unknown, but the condition of the remains suggested concealment rather than random chance. The bones were arranged unnaturally, tucked inward, knees drawn toward the chest, as if placed deliberately. It wasn't consistent with a natural collapse. That one detail began to reshape the narrative. Authorities reviewed every piece of surveillance footage they had from the park, not just from the week Evan vanished, but from the months and years after. Maintenance logs were pulled, soil delivery receipts, landscaper contracts. Nothing stood out, nothing that could place a suspect, no record of unauthorized activity. But what haunted investigators most was this. If Evan had been buried later, someone had returned to a park filled with children, with parents nearby, and buried a body in open daylight or under cover of night, and no one saw a thing. Detectives revisited old interviews. They reopened every file from the original case, starting with those who had been at the park that day. The question now wasn't who had taken Evan, it was who had come back. Rumors reignited, neighbors whispered, theories resurfaced and mutated. One former volunteer claimed to remember soft soil near the slide but had dismissed it at the time. Another recalled seeing a man with a shovel days after the disappearance, someone she assumed was city maintenance. But there had been no scheduled work that week. In the lab, forensic specialists examined the clothing and bone structure for signs of restraint or injury. Early analysis found slight indentations on the wrist bones, potentially consistent with ligature marks. They couldn't say for certain. The years had worn down most surfaces, but it was enough to raise suspicions. Enough to suggest that Evan hadn't simply wandered off and fallen into the ground. News of the confirmation spread fast. National headlines resurfaced the story. The town was thrust back into the spotlight, and with it came renewed scrutiny. Questions poured in faster than answers. Why hadn't the police found him? Had the original search failed, or had someone manipulated the timeline in a way no one had expected? In press briefings, law enforcement remained measured. The case, they emphasized, was now an active homicide investigation. But behind closed doors, the mood was different, not triumphant, not even relieved, just quiet. Because for everyone involved, the revelation came with a darker realization. Evan Mitchell hadn't vanished without a trace. The trace had been there the whole time, just beneath their feet. Once the DNA confirmed the remains were Evan's, investigators turned inward. The search for a perpetrator hadn't stopped, but before they could move forward, they needed to understand how they'd failed so catastrophically in the first place. The slide had been part of the initial search grid. It was documented, photographed, cleared. The sand below it had even been sifted in the first 72 hours. Officers had stood where Evan's body would eventually be found, combed through the very soil that had hidden him for nearly a decade. The public wanted justice, but law enforcement first needed something far more elusive: answers. Review teams pulled every log, every timestamp, every photo from the 2016 search. A heat map showed dense coverage of the slide area. Multiple volunteer teams had passed through, some more than once. The cadaver dogs had worked it. Drones had scanned overhead. But no alert had ever been made. Not a single clue had pointed to that spot. Investigators brought in canine search experts, trying to understand what could have gone wrong. Some theorized that the dogs hadn't missed a body at all, because there wasn't one there to begin with. Others pointed to conditions, wind patterns, depth of burial, even the possibility that the scent profile was too faint due to early decomposition in sand. But none of the explanations felt satisfying. They were possibilities, not certainties, and certainly not closure. Then came the deeper question: had someone returned? The idea was more than just chilling. It was destabilizing. If Evan hadn't been buried the night he vanished, it meant someone had quietly re-entered a sealed, high-profile crime scene sometime afterward, weeks, months, years, and placed his body beneath the slide. It sounded improbable, but not impossible. Records showed the park reopened 4 weeks after the initial search ended. By that time, active patrols had ceased. Cameras hadn't been installed. There was a period, short but real, when someone could have come back under cover of darkness, buried the remains, smoothed the surface, walked away unnoticed. It was a theory no one wanted to believe, but they couldn't ignore it, so they started looking into who had access to the park during that gap. Maintenance logs showed 3 landscaping visits between July and August of 2016. 2 were basic lawn jobs. One, dated July 22nd, included a sand redistribution beneath the playground equipment. The report had been filed electronically and closed out by a worker named Douglas Heiler. He'd worked for the Parks Department for 9 years. No criminal history, no previous involvement in the case. When interviewed, he told officers he didn't remember anything unusual, said he was in and out in less than an hour, but his name hadn't appeared in any of the initial interviews from 2016. Somehow, a man who'd physically worked the slide area weeks after Evan's disappearance had never been spoken to. A gap in the investigation. Not malicious, not intentional, but critical. He wasn't the only one. A retired city worker came forward voluntarily after the news broke. Said he'd seen a man digging near the slide sometime after all the flyers came down. He couldn't remember the exact date, just that it was early morning, and the man told him he was doing soil leveling for the Parks Department. When asked if he reported it, the retiree shook his head. He said it didn't seem out of place at the time. As these small, disjointed memories came forward, new possibilities emerged. Maybe the body had been hidden elsewhere at first, stored in an abandoned structure, a crawl space, even someone's property, and then later moved. If so, that meant Evan had been missing, dead or alive, for days before being buried. A separate, darker question began to form. Had he died on the day he disappeared, or had he been held somewhere? Forensic analysis wasn't clear. The condition of the bones and clothing made determining time of death nearly impossible. But the absence of trauma left the door open for several scenarios. None of them gave the family comfort. The alternative explanation was almost worse. Maybe the body had been there all along, and it had simply been missed. Investigators reviewed sand composition reports and consulted geotechnical engineers. One theory proposed that wind and weather could have gradually buried shallow remains deeper, essentially hiding them beneath years of compacted sediment. Another suggested that the child's body may have been beneath a concrete footing that was later shifted during playground maintenance. If true, it meant that the answer had been sitting just inches out of reach the entire time. The media latched onto this one. Negligence. Human error. A preventable tragedy made worse by procedural failures. Critics accused the original investigators of rushing the early search. Volunteers questioned why the area hadn't been excavated more thoroughly. Lawsuits were threatened. A few officers retired quietly. Others stayed, burdened by guilt they couldn't shake. For the lead detective, now 9 years older, it was personal. He had stood beside that slide. He had marked the area as clear. He had looked Evan's mother in the eye and told her they would find her son. And he had been wrong. But it wasn't just about guilt. It was about a deeper unease, because every theory, every expert explanation rested on the same uncertain foundation. No one could say for sure when Evan had been buried. No one could say who had done it. And most disturbingly, no one could explain how a boy vanished in plain sight, only to be found exactly where they had all looked. And that's where the investigation stood, on a foundation of fractured assumptions, questionable memories, and growing fear that the person responsible hadn't vanished at all, but had stayed close, hiding in the shadows of a mistake no one had realized they made. The morning after the news broke, the town changed. It didn't happen all at once, no sirens, no curfews, but something in the atmosphere shifted. A tension crept through the streets, subtle but unmistakable. It was in the way parents gripped their children's hands tighter, in how eyes lingered longer on strangers, and in the way conversations trailed off mid-sentence when someone mentioned the park. Meadowbrook had always been a quiet place, a safe place. That illusion collapsed the moment people learned Evan Mitchell had been found buried in the sand of the very playground where he disappeared. Local Facebook groups flooded with reactions. Some were expressions of grief, others were raw fury, but many were filled with something darker, distrust. People wanted to know how a child's body could go undiscovered beneath a slide for 9 years, how search teams could miss it, how dogs, experts, and volunteers, all working tirelessly, had somehow overlooked the one place that mattered most. The theories started immediately. Some whispered about corruption, others believed in incompetence. But a growing number of residents didn't think it was a mistake at all. They believed someone had come back. The implications of that possibility began to ripple outward. If the killer had returned to the scene days or weeks later, that meant someone local had the knowledge, the timing, and the nerve to bury a child in broad daylight or in the dead of night, right under the noses of a grieving town. The fear wasn't abstract anymore. It was next door. The thought spread like a sickness. Everyone began revisiting old memories, wondering what they missed, replaying conversations from years ago. A man down the street remembered a neighbor walking his dog at odd hours that summer. A woman swore she'd seen a maintenance truck in the park months after the disappearance, but couldn't recall the date. Old rumors resurfaced about a teacher who moved away suddenly, a divorce that happened right after the search, a house that had been sold in cash. Detectives reopened interviews with people who'd been at the park the day Evan vanished. But after 9 years, recollections had turned into guesses. Timelines blurred, details contradicted each other. One mother, who'd once testified with certainty that Evan had slid down and ran toward the swings, now said she might have confused him with another boy in a red shirt. Another parent confessed she never actually saw Evan on the slide, just heard someone mention he was there. The foundation of the original investigation, already fragile, began to crack under the weight of time and uncertainty. Even those who had once been vocal about their involvement grew silent. Some refused to speak to police at all, not out of guilt, but fear. No one wanted their name connected to something that now felt far more sinister than a tragic disappearance. The town began to fold in on itself. Doors closed earlier. Neighborhood events were canceled. Parents who once let their kids ride bikes to the park now insisted on driving them and watching every second from a bench. And even then, they kept glancing toward the old metal slide like it might offer some new clue. The Mitchells declined all interviews. Their house became a magnet for reporters, but no one answered the door. On the 4th night after the discovery, someone placed candles along their walkway. By morning, more than 100 had been lit, but Jamie never came out to see them. She stayed inside, away from the spectacle, holding on to the one truth that had broken her beyond repair. Her son had never left the place she stood crying 9 years ago. He'd been there, under her feet, and she hadn't known. That was the wound that reopened now for her. Not just grief, not just rage, but shame. As paranoia took hold, neighbors turned on each other. Anonymous tips flooded the department. A man was reported for walking his dog near the playground after dark. A retired teacher was accused of being too quiet during the search. A former janitor who'd worked at the nearby elementary school received threatening messages. None of these people were suspects, but that didn't matter anymore. Logic had taken a backseat to fear. The killer, it seemed, could have been anyone, and that meant everyone was suspect. Behind closed doors, investigators admitted what they didn't say publicly. They had no new leads, no DNA that didn't belong, no fingerprints, no sign of forced burial, just a broken timeline and a child's remains buried in plain sight. Without a confession or a breakthrough in forensics, the chances of arrest were slim, but telling the town that would have destroyed what little calm remained. In the weeks that followed, the park was closed again. Not for investigation, just out of respect. Some argued it should be torn down. Others wanted a memorial, but most people just wanted it gone. It had become a scar too visible to ignore, a wound that wouldn't close. Because no matter how many theories were offered, negligence, oversight, deliberate cover-up, none of them erased the central horror. That someone, somewhere, buried a child in the middle of a neighborhood. And for 9 years, no one knew. As the forensic excavation continued into its final phase, investigators worked in silence, cataloging every fragment of cloth, bone, and soil with exhausting precision. The area beneath the slide had already given up more than anyone ever expected, but it was the smallest detail, barely noticed at first, that changed everything. Caught deep within the fabric of Evan's shirt, almost fused into it by time and pressure, were several thin strands of material. Not from the shirt itself, not plant matter, fibers, coarse, synthetic. When examined under magnification, they matched the weave of rope, twisted, frayed, and consistent with restraint. It wasn't just a burial now, it was control. Someone had tied him, someone had held him. The implications were immediate. Evan hadn't wandered, he hadn't fallen, he had been bound, which meant someone had taken him, had enough time, privacy, and intent to restrain a 7-year-old child, and then, somehow, managed to bury him in a location that had already been under heavy scrutiny. Forensics couldn't determine how long the fibers had been there, or exactly how tight they'd been tied. The years had taken most of the evidence. The wrist's bones showed slight notching, consistent with pressure. Not definitive, but enough. Enough to shift the investigation toward something colder, more calculated. This wasn't accidental. This was placement. A child didn't crawl beneath the ground and vanish. He was put there. The detectives brought in to examine the evidence had seen every kind of case. But even they struggled with this one, because now, even with a body, they still had no suspect, no eyewitness, no timeline, just fibers, sand, and silence. The rope didn't lead anywhere. No brand, no specific material unique enough to trace. It might have come from anywhere, from anyone. They revisited old persons of interest, re-ran background checks, re-interviewed long-forgotten witnesses. Nothing held, no one cracked, no one returned to the scene, and no one confessed. What they had was a dead child, buried deliberately in a place he should never have been, and whoever had done it had gotten away with it, at least long enough for the evidence to decay and for time to erase the path back. Eventually, the investigation slowed. Leads stopped coming. Resources thinned out. Public attention moved on, slowly but inevitably. But what stayed behind, what never left, was that one fact, unchanging and impossible to ignore. Evan didn't die alone in the woods. He didn't wander off and get lost. He was taken, restrained, and buried beneath the very place that was meant to keep him safe. And whoever did it might have walked home, might have waved at a neighbor, might have eaten dinner, gone to work the next day, and never said a word. Which meant that even now, after all these years, the person who buried Evan Mitchell could still be walking free, hidden in plain sight.